Hi, good afternoon. Today we'll be talking about a very important topic in economics, and that is the principle of microeconomics. Microeconomics is the study of what is likely to happen or tendencies when individuals make choices in response to changes in incentives, prices, resources, and or method of production. Individual actors are often grouped into microeconomic subgroups, such as we have consumer. So we have consumers, or you can call it the buyer, and also we have producers. So these groups create the supply and demand for resources using money as a pricing mechanism for coordination. So microeconomics is the study of scarcity, we can say that. What do we mean by scarcity? By scarcity, we mean that how household or an individual or a consumer, firm or producers make decision knowing that we are living in the world of scarcity. Scarcity in economics refers to when the demand for a resource is greater than the supply of that resources. And as the resources are limited, so scarcity results in a consumers having to make a decisions on how best to allocate resources in order to satisfy all basic needs and as many wants as possible. So the primary cause of economic scarcities are demand-induced, supply-induced, and structural. So the demand-induced refers to when supply remains static and a demand grows. And supply-induced is when the supply of a resources is below that of a demand. And structural is when a portion of a population does not have the same access to resources as another portion of the population. So in economic, scarcity is a key, and that is the reason that in microeconomics we teach constraint optimization. In mathematical optimization, a constraint optimization in some context, it's called constraint optimization, is basically the process of optimizing an objective function with respect to some variables in the presence of a constraints on those variables. So the idea of a constraint optimization is that the choices of one variable often affects the amount of another variable that can be used. Example, if a firm employs more labor. So if a firm employs more labor, and this might affect the amount of capital it can afford to rent if it is restricted, means constrained by how much it can spend on inputs. So when a consumer maximizes, their utility, means that that's the objective function. So we have a bundle of X and Y must be affordable, given that income provides the constraint. So when a government sets expenditure levels, it faces constraint set by its income from the taxes. Another example is any optimal example like profit maximization or cost minimization, which the firms are facing. The quantities obtained when under a constraint may be different from the quantities that might be achieved if the agents were unconstrained. So in brief, constraint optimization is a process of individual and firms make choices in the world of scarcity. And this brings us to the concept of trade-off. When the resources are scarce, the individuals or households and the firms adopt different alternatives to make themselves as well off as possible. And you will never hear any economist saying that you can have everything. They will say you have to make trade-offs. You have to give up A to get B. Economists will say that how you take resources giving to you to optimize your utility. I think by now, I'm sure that you know that microeconomics is the process of how people making decisions to consume and firms make a decision to produce. In microeconomics, we have two major actors. The first one, as we mentioned before, is consumer. And the second one is producers. So there's consumers and there's producers. So microeconomists are going to build a model to explain as to how the consumers and the producers behave. Now, this brings us to the issue of a modeling. An economic model is a simplified version of a reality that allows us to describe or observe, understand, and make prediction about economic behavior of two or more variables. So the purpose of a model is to take a complex real-world situation and pare it down to the essentials. If designed well, a model can give the analyst a better understanding of the situation and any related problems. However, these models are never precise, like a scientific model of describing a relationship between two variables. In economics, we are making some assumptions to capture the main tendencies of the data. And why is this? Because we want to know how consumers make consumption decision and how firms make decision to produce. But the proof will not be as precise as you probably see in engineering and in some of the science courses. So these models should be able to explain the economic reality as much as possible, because if the model cannot explain the reality, it is not useful. And we need a model that is tractable. By tractable, a model tractable is a model, one that you can teach it easily and solve, which means there are several types of tractability. We have the analytical tractability. We have means finding a solution to a theoretical model. And we have empirical. Tractability, being able to estimate or calibrate your model. And we have a computational. Tractability, which is finding a numerical solution. So consumers are constrained by their limited wealth or resources in their disposal, which we call it a budget constraint. So consumers are subject to their budget constraint. That is in economics. And subject to that constraint, they choose a set of bundles. They choose a set of bundles that makes them satisfy and as well as possible. And this is called utility maximization problem. So consumer are maximizing their utility function subject to their budget constraint. So in microeconomics, the utility maximization problem is the problem that consumer faces, and how I as a consumer spend my money in order to maximize my utility. It is a type of optimal decision problem. So it consists of choosing how much of each available goods or services to consume. If we have a X and Y as a bundle of goods, then microeconomics is telling us that how I as a consumer spend my money in order to maximize my utility function subject to my budget constraint. And it is the type of optimal decision that I have to make, that it consists of choosing how much of each of these available goods or services to consume, considering a constraint on a total spending, which is my income, and the prices of goods and their preferences, that which I prefer and the price of these goods. So that is the problem that as a consumer I am facing. So utility maximization is an important concept in consumer theory, as in it shows that how consumer decides to allocate their income. Because consumers are rational, they seek to extract the most benefit for themselves. So due to the bounded rationality and other biases, so consumers sometimes pick bundles that do not necessarily maximize their utility. So the utility maximization bundle of the consumer is also not set and can change over time depending on their individual preferences of goods and services, price changes, and increase or decrease in income. So consumer maximizes their utility subject to your budget constraint. And this utility function will be the model of preferences. That would be the model of preferences. Everything individual wants goes into utility function. Everything in terms of wants, consumer wants, it goes to this utility function. And all the resources available to disposal goes into the budget constraint. All the resources the consumer have, it goes to this constraint. And by optimizing that function, we can determine how individual makes consumption decision. When we solve this one, then that tells us that how they make a decision. Now, this is the first part for a consumer. And we say, now, the second part of the question is its producers, which is the firms. Firms, on the other hand, are going to maximize their profit. And profit in economics, we used to do this pi, which is the Latin alphabet. And in economics, profit maximization is the short run or long run process by which firms may determine the price, input and output level. And that will lead to the highest profit. So the firm's profit maximization function will be subject to both consumer demand. So this producers is subject to consumer demand and to costs of input. So the firm's profit maximization function, as we said, will be subject to both consumers' demand and input cost. And this is a bit problematic to solve because the firm must know what consumer wants first and how do I make it what they want. So they must know the output side as to what consumer wants us as a firm to make, and how much is that going to cost the firms to produce, and how they should combine to maximize their profit. So how they should combine the price of the cost of inputs and the demand to maximize their profit. And this will lead us to three fundamental questions in microeconomics that has been often asked. So the three fundamental questions. Number one, what should we produce? So what goods and services should be produced? That's the first question that is asked. And number two is, how should we produce it? Means how to produce the goods and the services. And three is, for whom should we produce? Means who gets the goods and the services. So all of these three fundamental microeconomic questions that drives the entire economy solved by using another key state variable called prices. Prices will solve all of these problems. So consumer and firms interact in the marketplace, and as a result of their interaction emerges a set of prices. And in light of these prices, consumers and firms make those decisions. So, for example, if we have a BlackBerry, for instance, now it's outdated, but at the time when BlackBerry was very famous, when firms see signals in the market that consumers willing to pay for BlackBerry, what they do is that they will calculate their prices of inputs. And by calculating the price of inputs, they would decide how much profit margin they want and decides to produce it or not. So here, something is very clear, is that the prices decides what gets to produce and how it is produced and who gets the goods that are produced. So these three questions have been answered using prices. So there are some instances that, for example, that prices do not get to decide that should be produced. A good example of it is that a ticket for a concert or a game. You like a concert or a game that many other people are interested going to. So many of you probably have observed that some time you see a huge lineup of people to get a ticket. It's not very common these days, but if it was very common in the past, if price determines everything, then we shouldn't see any of these lines. So it should be such that those who are willing to pay the most should get the ticket, and those who do not want to pay the most should not get the ticket. The question is, why should there be a line? And that is why economists say that the world is not perfect. However, the secondary price mechanism that we have right now, like eBay and these other auction sites, replace the line mechanism as a way of allocating those tickets. So this is how microeconomists thinks about the role of a price in an economy. So at the highest level, we have two types of economics. The first one is we have theoretical economics, and two, we have empirical economics. Theoretical economics, which is number one, is the process of building models that has some testable prediction to explain economic phenomena. On the other hand, empirical economics is the process of gathering the data to test those models using econometrics or statistical methods in the form of statistical regressional analysis to show how credible the results are. So this brings us to the concept of positive and normative economics. So positive economics this is the distinction between the ways things are, which is the positive economics. How things are right now. How things are, this is the positive economics. And the way should be, the way things should be, that's the normative economics. A perfect competitive market is a good example. By competitive market, we means that the producers are price takers. Competitive market, let me write it down. Competitive market. So in competitive market is a good example. And in competitive market, we mean that the producers are a price taker and offers the goods and services to a wide range of consumers. The consumers bid up the prices till the person with the highest value for the goods gets it. Price here is a signal allocation of goods and services. So in auction, you offer a product for sale and people bid on it, and whoever value that product the most gets it. And this means by using prices, we can allocate goods as to who wants it the most. So in some auction site, someone was telling me that they have offered a COVID-19 vaccine in auction at the time of a height of pandemic where we didn't have a vaccine and many people were dying. So there was someone site which offered the vaccine and the price of vaccine went very, very high. So since the price went very high, I think it was maybe a scam or somehow it was shut down because all of those rich people were trying to get that vaccine because they could afford it and they wanted to save themselves. So the question is why the price of that vaccine, if it's true, and I can't say for sure because I haven't seen it myself, but I have heard it. If that's true, then the question is why the price of that vaccine went so high. In terms of economically thinking, that is a positive question. And here we do not forget that there is another twin forces in economics, which is supply and demand. So we have another twin forces, which is supply and demand. Quantity and prices. And we have supply and we have demand. And that is our equilibrium, where supply is equal to demand. So these twin forces drives the economy. Demand is how much consumer wants and supply is how much is there to have. The intuition is surprising. And that is that the higher the demand for goods and services, the higher the prices. The less supply there is, the higher the prices as well, and vice versa. What do we mean? If the demand is low, the price will be lower. And if there is an excessive supply, then the price will be lower as well. And in a very famous and a good example by Adam Smith in Wealth of Nation in 1976, where he used an example of a diamond and water. And if we think waters are more important for survival, but it is free and the diamond is not necessary for survival, but the price is astronomical. And the question is, how can this be? The demand for water is much higher than the diamond, but the supply of water is even higher or even larger. So the demand is higher, but the supply is much higher. So the price ends up being lower as we talk about the supply and demand. And that was an example. As I said before, it was used by an Adam Smith in his essay, Wealth of the Nation, 1926. So in diamond case, if you look at it, the supply is much lower than the demand with the higher prices, and that is a positive analysis. Most of us do not need university course to understand the prices because it's really easy to see that if there is the higher the demand, the higher the prices. The lower the demand, the lower the prices. And if there is a shortage of supply in the market, the higher the prices. And also if there is an excessive supply in the market, is the lower the prices. However, when it comes to normative question, we say the other one was just a positive question. But when it comes to a normative question, the thing is that should this auction be allowed for certain transaction to happen? And we could mention many, many other examples. And a good example, it should be the vaccine, if it's true. Should that vaccine auction have happened? And that brings us to the equity issue in the society. Some people in our society, especially if the society is just, as a society, we may feel that it is unfair that rich people can get things and poor people can't. So here is a pure equity component to it. And this means that society value equity. People should not get shots at things because they are wealthy and rich. In the example of during the election in Canada, I was watching the debate between the leaders of federal parties in Canada. And in the election debate, NDP was calling on the Liberals to stop extending tax cuts to rich people in Canada. The Liberals were arguing that those taxes will promote economic recovery, but the NDP arguing that that is unfair for rich people to get tax breaks. So that argument about fairness matters to most of Canadians in terms of driving that kinds of economic policies government needs to make. But microeconomists focuses on efficiency optimization and how to allocate the resources. Behind all of this is the normative issue, which is what should be happening and how should the economy be functioning. Finally, as we say repeatedly that microeconomics is a process of how individual and firm makes a decision. We can give an example. If you want to buy an iPad or Chromebook for your schoolwork, and you have a choice between buying a new one or a used one. We know that the new one costs more than the used one, and you must be willing to take the chances to invest in a used iPad or Chromebook, knowing that the additional features in new iPad or Chromebook that you need to do your schoolwork. So you have to ask yourself, what are the odds that you need the added features in the new iPad or Chromebook. So here you are thinking about preferences by realizing how much risk you're willing to take. The second thing would be that you're budget constrained. So first one is your preferences, either your preferences a new one, or you prefer a Chromebook or iPad, or you want to use and pay less for a used one. But then there is a risk that you have to take. Or you're a risk lover, you're risk averse, or you're risk neutral. So the second thing is that you have to look to your pocket, to your resources that are available for you to in your disposal to be utilized. And that is your budget constraint. How much money you have and how much you're willing to pay for it. So finally, you will take your preferences of a choice what you want and your budget constraint, the amount of money you have, and you go to the market and see the differences in the prices. And what microeconomists do, they solve that constraint optimization problem. In life, individuals are making constraint optimization decisions that will affect their lives. So the job of microeconomist is how to solve and model to understand the function of the economy. So that's the first one, just the introduction to microeconomics, and we will continue with other videos in the future. Take care.